This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Eve Engler. The Israeli military is committing unfathomable horrors in Gaza, extermination program in northern Gaza, violence elsewhere in the region. As this is taking place, we know that there are Canadians participating directly in the violence. We know there's many media reports, dozens, maybe even hundreds of Canadians fighting with the Israeli military. And there's also others that are assisting the Israeli military in different ways. One of these groups that's received a bit of attention recently, and there's an upcoming court case surrounding, is the organization Sarel. To discuss Sarel and this issue, we have lawyer Shane Martinez, who has launched the private prosecution on Sarel. So first of all, Shane, thanks for coming on Talking Foreign Policy. And could you start off by giving us a bit of an overview of Sarel?
So certainly, thanks for having me on, Eve. So I guess, we can kind of go back to the beginnings with this. Sarel was founded quite some time ago, back in 1983. It was following the Galilee War by the former head of Israel's paratrooper and infantry corps. And the organization, it was developed initially to provide a volunteer-based response to what they saw as labor shortages, which arose during times of armed conflict when people were called up to combat. And today, though, it works closely with the Israeli military. And what it does is that it recruits volunteers from both within and outside Israel. And it relies heavily on international participants from the United States, Canada, and elsewhere. Uh, it engages volunteers to really maintain the IDF's day-to-day logistical operations. And Israel's Ministry of Defense, it publicly acknowledges that it acquires services from Sarel in the area of volunteer recruitment for the Israeli military. And the Israeli military advertises Sarel as an opportunity to volunteer for it without becoming an Israeli citizen. And just so there's no doubt about the nature of the engagement, Sarel, it's very deeply intertwined with the Israeli military, if your viewers haven't gathered that already. Volunteers with Sarel, they reside on army bases. They wear Israeli military fatigues. They have to follow a strict code of conduct set by the Israeli military. They have to refrain from taking pictures of anything that might be even potentially classified as being sensitive. Volunteers are prohibited from mentioning the names or specific locations of bases that they serve on. And these volunteers from all over the world, they work alongside and under the direction of Israeli soldiers to perform duties typically assigned to Israeli soldiers. And that includes things such as packing food rations or medical kits, cleaning tanks, painting helmets, radio repairs, refurbishing gas masks. Some of them work with firearms as well. And the Sarel website, it explains that the value of Sarel to the Israeli military, it's realized through Sarel volunteers serving wherever they're needed to take on what are called routine logistical support tasks that are normally assigned to active duty soldiers and reservists. So they're carrying out the exact same tasks that are typically assigned to soldiers. Now, back in 2014, it was reported that the Sarel program, it actually saves the Israeli military about $12 million US annually through the work of volunteers. And perhaps more importantly, it frees up regular soldiers and reservists to kind of go to the front lines and engage in combat or other tasks. Uh, as for its Canadian branch, Sarel Canada was started up back in 2006, and it has offices in both Montreal and Toronto. And it describes itself as the Canadian representative of Sarel and purports to act only as an intermediary between participants here and Sarel in Israel. So, what can we glean from that? Well, Sarel Canada is effectively recruiting or inducing individuals within Canada to volunteer with the Israeli military, but it's Sarel in Israel that facilitates those arrangements and engagements on the ground. Uh, Now, applications from Canadians who are seeking to volunteer, they have to be scrutinized and undergo a security clearance from the Israeli military. And every year, Sorel Canada recruits between about 150 to 180 Canadians to assist the Israeli military. It's been reported that Canadian volunteers they routinely take place. They routinely participate in kind of the work that I described. And they can stock tanks with supplies such as ammunition and bulletproof vests. And activities also include preparing equipment for soldiers so that if a war was to break out, soldiers would have quick access to the equipment that they need. Now, all of this is to say that there's a real problem here. So, where's the problem? Well, the problem comes in where the law intersects with these activities. And the applicable law here is something that's called the Foreign Enlistment Act. And Section 11, Sub 1 of the Foreign Enlistment Act states that any person who within Canada recruits or otherwise induces any person or body of persons to enlist or to accept any commission or engagement in the armed forces of any foreign state or other armed forces operating in that state is guilty of an offense. Now, there's some question about, well, what does recruit mean? Or what does induce mean? So the courts have previously defined the word recruit as meaning to persuade or help someone do something or to get someone involved in something. Induce is similarly defined, and we can kind of look to Black's Law Dictionary, which is our main text for legal definitions, which defines induce as meaning to bring about or to affect or cause, to influence an act or course of conduct, to lead by persuasion or reasoning, to incite by motives or to prevail upon. And Sarel's website, it's our position that it does recruit and induce individuals to accept an engagement with the Israeli armed forces because it implores them to join the adventure as a volunteer in Israel, to work with IDF soldiers. It offers free accommodations, free meals, free uniforms, and lectures and other incentives to volunteers. And in fact, until recently, Sarel Canada's website, it even had a subsection there about volunteering during the war, as they put it. So for all of these reasons, there are reasonable grounds on which some people in the community are rightfully concerned that Sarel Canada's activities may amount to criminal conduct that violates the Foreign Enlistment Act.
And I can say that for many years, the Canadian Jewish News, the Sarel ad was there every week, calling on people to express their Zionism by volunteering on an Israeli military base. So none of this is hidden; it's pretty out in the open. You've brought a case. It's been brought forward to courts. Can you describe a little bit about? And I know it's been going on a couple of years, and there's an upcoming. Uh, Before the courts on November 7th as well. Can you give us a little bit of background and where things are at on the legal side?
For sure. So there's a bit of a history here, as you mentioned. We can kind of go back to April of 2021. At that point, someone named David Meviser, who's a rabbi based in Hamilton, Ontario, he attempted to have Parliament look at the issue of Israeli military recruitment in Canada. And he tried to do this by starting up parliamentary petitions. One of them on this particular issue garnered over 7,700 signatures. Ultimately, however, there was no action taken by the federal government. About a year later, in March of 2022, Rabbi Meviser and a Palestinian artist named Dr. Rahab Nazal, they jointly filed a complaint with the Toronto Police Service alleging that Sarel Canada was violating the Foreign Enlistment Act. And the police appeared to have taken no action whatsoever in relation to that complaint. So fast forward a bit more to September of 2022, Rabbi Meviser and Dr. Nazal hired my office to pursue what's called a private prosecution against Sarel Canada. Now, this is a procedural mechanism under the criminal code that allows for private citizens to commence criminal proceedings. And this is a way to try to ensure that people are not left hopeless if the state refuses to take action on legitimate complaints for whatever reason they may choose not to take action, as was the case here. So what ended up taking place is that Rabbi Meviser and Dr. Nazal had to go before court. A justice of the peace, who functions like a judge, reviewed all of the evidence presented by Rabbi Mivaser and Dr. Nizal. She also heard Rabbi Mivaser's viva voce testimony, which was tested under cross-examination by a representative of the Crown's Public Prosecution Service. And it was undisputed that Sarel Canada recruits delivered volunteer services to the Israeli military, that they received material benefits from it in exchange. They agreed to be bound by certain obligations as well. And the Justice of the Peace found that sufficient evidence had been presented on each element of the offense, including the issue of whether an engagement existed between the volunteers and the Israeli military. So, process was then issued against Sarel Canada for allegedly violating a Canadian criminal statute, being the Foreign Enlistment Act, which means that Sarel Canada was formally charged with a crime. And this is, to the best of my knowledge, the first and only time that any act of recruitment on behalf of the Israeli military has ever been prosecuted in Canada. Now, curiously, at the hearing, the representative of the Public Prosecution Service of Canada agreed that Rabbi Mivaser and Dr. Nizal had presented sufficient evidence that Sarel Canada recruited or otherwise induced individuals to accept engagements with the IDF. Sufficient evidence was presented for process to issue, for the charge to be laid. However, we go forward a little bit to December of 2022, the Crown ended up reversing its position. It exercised this authority and discretion that it has to intervene in the case and take it over from Rabbi Mivaser and Dr. Nizal. Immediately after it took over the case, it terminated the prosecution against Sarel Canada before the case could ever make it to trial. And the Crown's reasoning was that it was now claiming that there was no evidence on an essential element of the offense, which was, is there an engagement between the volunteers and the Israeli military? And so the Crown was now saying, oh, there's no evidence on that, therefore there's no reasonable prospect of conviction. Now, this is, of course, after the Crown had previously acknowledged in court that, in fact, there was evidence of this when the charge was laid. So the case has found its way through an appellate process, and it's now before the Ontario Court of Appeal. The appeal is scheduled to be heard on November the 7th. I'll be litigating that with my very esteemed colleague, Sharif Foda, and we're going to be arguing that the criminal case against Sarel Canada, that it should be reinstated and permitted to continue. We're also going to be explaining to the court that, in our respectful view, the Crown's interference and termination of the prosecution was in fact an abusive process, and that it reflects a much deeper tendency of legal exceptionalism where Israel's military is concerned. For example, in addition to this refusal to prosecute bona fide and well-supported allegations, Canada has previously lobbied the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court to not investigate Israel's alleged war crimes. Canada has also failed to abide by the Arms Trade Treaty and our own domestic legislation about arms exports through its continued exportation or issuance of export permits for arms to be sent to Israel. Canada refuses to enforce CRA policy to rescind the charitable status of organizations which are funneling money to subsidize the operations of Israel's Ministry of Defense. And Canada also engages in military-to-military cooperation with Israel through the Canada-Israel Strategic Partnership, despite this being in clear violation of its international obligations to prevent war crimes and crimes against humanity. So there's really a clear and discernible pattern here of exceptionalism, legal exceptionalism, where the Israeli military is concerned. But in this instance, in this case, our objective is fairly narrow, and that is to attempt to get the prosecution back on track to try and ensure that the rule of law is respected.
So that's very interesting. I say online there is some people who seem to be a bit confused. Some pro-Palestinian people who think of Sarel as a registered charity. It is not a registered charity, and so it's not violating the CRA rules around supporting a foreign military, as are groups like the Hesek Foundation, Canadian Zionist Cultural Association, and others. It's also not it's not recruiting or inducing people to join the military in the sense that most people would have in mind, and that it's this question of their the word engagement with the Israeli military. But there has been efforts over the years to um, prosecute Canadian or other institutions, individuals who are pushing to recruit, induce Canadians to join the Israeli military. So back in, I think October of 2020, there was a public letter signed by a number of prominent people, Chomsky, Roger Waters, I believe maybe Linda McQuiggs, people like that, calling on the Canadian government to look into a number of individuals that had induced Canadians to join the Israeli military. The Justice Minister at the time, Lametti, even though this appeared on the front page of the Le Devoir, he just submitted, "This is not up to us. I want nothing to do with this. This is an RCMP question." And then it was brought to the RCMP, and the RCMP kind of dropped that as well. So there are many, I guess, facets to this Canadian support for the Israeli military. Can you just maybe kind of, break a little bit of that down? I know you've been involved in on the registered charity side. Then there's again also the joining, becoming a soldier in the Israeli military, and then Sarel, which is about supporting the Israeli military. Yeah, maybe a little bit on any of those elements.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's great that you mentioned that. I mean, again, this I think really illustrates this legal exceptionalism that we're talking about. We can imagine for a moment that if organizations in the community tried to bring to the federal government's attention military recruitment of the exact same nature by, let's say, Russia or North Korea or Iran or China. Imagine they had a program that was identical in all senses to what Sorel is doing. Imagine if they were recruiting volunteers to come over, volunteer in engagements with their military where they wear the military uniforms of those countries. They live on the military bases of those countries. They clean tanks, refurbish gas masks, do work with firearms and ammunition, so on and so forth. They follow strict orders from soldiers with respect to what they're allowed to do or not do. They have rules of confidentiality and other codes of conduct that they have to abide by. The federal government would not tolerate it for an instant. They would immediately identify it as being a violation of the Foreign Enlistment Act, which is what it is. But here we see a very different approach. We see that there's no political value for the Canadian state, given its priority and its agenda, to tackle this issue. So what do? They pretend that it doesn't exist. And when people try to actually stand up and do something about it, such as what Rabbi Mevaser and Dr. Nizal did, the government steps in and they interfere with that process and they shut it down to insulate the Israeli military from any scrutiny or criticism. So it is highly problematic, and I think it's something that demands a lot more of the public's attention and discussion.
And it will be interesting to see where things go with this court case. And again, we have to remember where this is all taking place in the context of the Israeli military committing unspeakable horrors in Gaza, bombing Iran, obviously a couple thousand people they've killed in Lebanon, bombing Syria regularly. So this is the broader political context of the Israeli military is one of this should be, if not the first, one of the first countries, militaries that Canada should have as little to do with as possible. But it's quite the opposite as you've outlined. Thanks a lot for coming on, talking foreign policy, Shane, and maybe we'll have you back if we have a successful court decision in 10 days or so.
Anytime. Thanks very much.